This is an explanation of the importance of Plato in the scope of philosophy, and also an identification of what philosophy as a techne is. Now, Plato is important because he discovered and perfected dialectic. He discovered and perfected proofs and disproofs, demonstration and refutation, which he was able to wield across a variety of subjects. Before him, dialectic lay incomplete and was as yet undeveloped in pre-Socratic thought. Although they used arguments, they used demonstrations to affirm some things, and they used refutation to disprove others, they were not yet able to collect the different forms of argument into somewhat of an abstract or a separate science in order to then be applied to different subjects. We find that in pre-Socratic thought, the arguments, even when using the correct syllogistic forms, are tied up with the subject matter of whatever they are investigating. Much of them investigating the physical world, about what is the substance of the physical world. What is the arche? What is the principle of the physical world? Others of them arguing about geometry, as Pythagoras was able to complete intricate proofs of the Pythagorean theorem, for example. And Thales also was able to use demonstrations, syllogistic demonstrations to prove that, for example, a triangle that is inscribed in a semicircle is always a right angle, is always a right angle triangle. That if there's a semicircle and you inscribe a triangle with equal sides, that will be a right angle. And if you extend the point of the triangle on the circumference, there will still be a right angle. As I have this on my arm, that is a right angle. And if you extend the triangle to the center with equal sides, that will still be a right angle. These pre-Socratic philosophers were able to compose proofs, syllogistic demonstrations. However, they were not able to collect together the forms of demonstration and refutation into a coherent whole that could then be applied to things like ethics and politics, as well as metaphysics and other subjects, which Plato was able to discover and perfect. And that is his importance for perfecting dialectic, the portions of which are demonstration from premises, starting with premises that are self-evident, and synthesizing a conclusion, nothing of which no part of the conclusion is not included already as what is agreed upon in the premises, so that the conclusion can be affirmed without doubt. After that, analysis, starting with a conclusion or any proposition, and isolating the premises which are inherent in that proposition, which is already agreed to. Then also demonstration, or then also definition, after demonstration and analysis, and the method of division, which you find in his sophist and statesman dialogues. Starting with the genus and dividing that into species, and dividing one of the species into another species, another set of species, so that, for example, when we're trying to define what human is, we start with animal as a genus. We divide that into two-legged and four-legged, and we follow the two-legged class in our investigation of definition of a human. And then we divide the two-legged class into winged and unwinged, and then we choose the unwinged, and so on. Now, Plato is able to collect all these forms of argument together into a skill. He was able to perfect the skill of argumentation because he was able to apply that to every subject. He was able to survey the course of things, of different kinds of things, of different subject matters. Whereas pre-Socratic philosophers had been somewhat confined to specific subject matters, and their arguments were not able to bridge the gap to other subjects because they had not isolated the forms of argument, and they had not focused on the form of argument itself. They had not focused on argumentation, taken as somewhat separable from the subject matter. This is to say that philosophy is nothing more than dialectic, that philosophy is equivalent with and the same as dialectic, and that Plato's importance, the importance of Plato, is his having perfected and discovered dialectic. And obviously, upon reading his dialogues, his passion for philosophy is a passion for argumentation. That is significant. He is not wishing to fixate on some conclusion, but with composing the process of argumentation, of demonstrations and refutations. That sort of activity of argumentation, of proofs and disproofs. And the focus on that is why his dialogues seem to somewhat run circularly, that they don't rest, because he is focused on a process of proving and refuting. And that philosophy is not concerned with collections of conclusions, and that a philosopher is not a name that is associated with them having these views as a list or as a worldview. Philosophy is not a worldview. Somebody doesn't have a philosophy. They can't say, this is my philosophy. No, philosophy is not a worldview, which everybody has. They don't have a philosophy. Philosophy is not a way of life. Philosophy is not a collection of conclusions that have been reached, even through demonstration. If those conclusions are considered as separate, as being a collection, this sort of arrangement of coherent ideas. None of that is philosophy. Philosophy is the method and process of dialectic, of argumentation. Not even the principles and the premises which a philosopher might start with can be thought of if taken as separate from the process of argumentation, as constituting their philosophy, nor a collection of their conclusions aside from the process of argumentation. That is, if those are taken as separate. The process of argumentation, of proof and disproof, of demonstration and refutation, without any of that, can be considered as philosophy. So somebody doesn't just have a philosophy. And Plato's significance is that he discovered the modes of proof and disproof, and he wielded them with agility and expertise. More so than anybody else, both before him and after him. And philosophy as dialectic again was not perfected yet, but undeveloped in the pre-Socratics. There were many skilled proofs of certain things. There were disproofs of certain things, but they hadn't focused, and I somewhat infer from that they hadn't been impassioned enough about actually the process of argumentation. So if philosophy is considered love of wisdom, which again was only a term used to distinguish what Pythagoras thought was a more elevated and ennobled course of investigation compared to other groups of teachers at his time. But if that is somewhat signifies anything, then the love of wisdom should not be thought of as anything else than the love of argument, of proofs and disproofs. For the pre-Socratics had focused on a subject matter which they were enveloped in. That is why their arguments, although well made, are somewhat restricted to their domain. And you don't see the fluid employment or the agile and skilled employment of the same kinds of arguments or of a variety of sorts of arguments across the board of different fields. Rather, you find pre-Socratic philosophers investigating the arche or principle or substance of the natural world, whether that is matter or what matter is. And you have some of them saying, the air is the principle of the natural world, and the air is infinite, and earth is the principle of the natural world, and earth reaches her roots down infinitely. And these are both infinite. And then you have other pre-Socratics saying, well, there can't be two infinites that are bounded by the surface of the earth. That if the air is infinite, then the air cannot be bounded by the surface of the earth. And if the earth reaches down infinitely, then that cannot be bounded by the surface of the earth either. And so you have the employment of skilled arguments, but in a restricted sense. Even with people like Pythagoras, who is most important for geometry, you have intricate arguments demonstrating completely certain mathematical propositions. However, you don't have a bridge to wield arguments sort of with winged step across other fields. You have these things, this forms of argument and the skill of argument as latent and undeveloped, as somewhat being arrived at haphazardly. And another pre-Socratic who this applies to is Parmenides, who discovered the principle of non-contradiction, the capstone of logic and of argument and dialectic. That if something is, that something can't both be and not be. That something can't both be and not be. If we agree that something is such and such, then the same thing can't not be such and such. Not in the same way, not at the same time, not in the same respect. But if something is both moving and unmoving, like a revolving sphere, then one part is not moving and one part is moving. That the circumference and the center and the axis remain in the same place, but the parts are revolving in order to resolve the contradiction, which would have to be abandoned. Because if someone could be walking and not walking at the same time, then the meaning of what walking is would be utterly destroyed. There'd be no meaning of the thing that you're affirming and denying of the same subject. Or in technical terms, the predicate, the thing that you predicate of a subject, if that is affirmed and denied in the same respect at the same time, then the meaning of the predicate is empty and void of meaning. That is why Parmenides' principle of non-contradiction, that something can't both be and not be at the same time, that something can't be and not be such and such at the same time, not be in the sense of an ontological argument even, that something can't be such and such and not be the same such and such at the same time and in the same respect. And also that being can't come from nothing. That is a different problem. These pre-Socratics employed argumentation within a certain field with often examples of skilled use of argument in some cases and less skilled displays of argumentation in others. Whereas Plato perfected the process of dialectic so as to collect the different forms of argument or the different kinds of argument, of demonstration and analysis, definition, and the process of division, or the method of division, into a coherent whole that could be wielded upon different subjects. And people think that lecturers speak about Plato's dialogues as being without affirmation. So that, for example, by the end of the dialogue, there may not be an affirmative conclusion of the definition of what was sought. However, through the course of which countless arguments are made with an affirmative stance in order to sometimes disprove others. And there is not a question that Plato produces affirmative conclusions as often, at least, as disproofs. And that part of the reason he says that philosophy was born from wonder or from some minor deity associated with wonder is because his affirmative proofs, the conclusion, if you approach the conclusion without the argument, would appear at first sight as disagreeable to most. And so there's a sense of wonder when you reach the conclusion that may at first sight have seemed disagreeable, resulting from premises that are self-evident, that cannot even be questioned. In the same way that the idea that a line is bounded by points on both sides can't be questioned, or the way that unity can't be divided in strictly arithmetical terms, and that you can't divide a unit of arithmetic into two halves, the way some numbers can be divided. Those sort of self-evident truths, which are obvious, can produce conclusions which have an air of wonder about them because they were not conventionally held. And his refutations also have an air of wonder about them because they show that a conventionally held opinion or position either results in a contradiction or follows from a contradiction or results in or follows from propositions which are absolutely not agreeable. Again, the importance of Plato is that he discovered dialectic and the canon of logic, and that he was unquestionably the most skilled at using arguments, of employing demonstration and refutation. And I don't mean logic in the sense of sort of algebraic equations that are used today, that are used to sort of calculate the validity of an argument or to calculate a conclusion. I don't know what they do with those. That is something altogether different. That signifies something very bad as having happened to reason. Even when they speak about the age of reason, often they're talking about something else. That syllogistic reasoning, that syllogistic demonstrations, two premises and a conclusion. The conclusion having nothing that hasn't already been agreed to, not containing anything that hasn't been already agreed to in the premises. So the conclusion has to be agreed to the two premises. You have to agree to the conclusion because there is nothing that is not, there is nothing contained in the conclusion which was not included in the premises. That kind of logic, of dialectic, is different than algebraic equations of computer code. What they speak of now is computer code of algebraic equations meant as calculating devices, which is a terrible sign for philosophy, for the course that philosophy has been through, because algebra even represents a turning away from demonstrative proofs, from syllogistic reasoning, as algebra is a algebra is a mixing of geometrical and arithmetical sciences in a disharmonious way. Algebra is applying numbers to lines, numbers which have nothing to do with lines and are discrete quantities. That is why for them, you can divide the one because the one is a part of a line and a line is infinitely divisible. And so the one could be divided into a half, into a quarter, into two. You can get two from one because you can divide the one into two halves. So algebra and calculus specifically destroy the principles of both geometry and arithmetic because they blend those into practical calculative devices that are not meant for theory, that don't consist of demonstrative proofs, but consist of calculative devices of calculation meant specifically for practical purposes and not for theory. That is why all that stuff just gets wasted once algebra even and calculus become prominent, that they disregard geometry at that point, when geometry is the greatest example we have of skilled demonstrations. There is no greater way to become acquainted with demonstrative reasoning and with syllogistic reasoning, the composition of syllogisms, as acquainting yourself with Euclidean geometry, as those are intricate strings of profound arguments. That is why Plato had over the door of his academy, on the doorway of his academy, something that said, a sign that said, those who are unacquainted with geometry, those who let none enter who don't know geometry. Because through geometry, as he describes in his Republic, dialectic is sort of awakened in us. You become familiar with demonstrative reasoning through familiarity with geometric proofs. Whereas algebra does not use premises and conclusions, does not use terms of language, does not use words, terms in propositional form, where if you agree to two premises, you have to agree to the conclusion, which geometry does. Instead, algebra is used as a calculation device for practical ends and has no concern with theory, as is calculus. Those are merely calculative devices, which is what modern logic is styled after and in the language of, which is basically computer code to me. That's why that is a sign of the complete unworthiness of modern philosophy. Those things are used, those things that overthrew geometry, which is which uses syllogistic reasoning better than any other science, and which the philosopher needs in order to even become acquainted with argumentation. That is abandoned in place, and algebra, which is a mere calculation for practical use, that doesn't use syllogistic reason, it doesn't demonstrate conclusions from premises, it merely is a calculative device that confounds number and shape into the measurement of lines in terms of numbers, mensuration of a line in terms of then a numerical value, when the line is a continuous quantity and the numerals are discrete quantities. That is why they divide the one because the one is taken as part of a line, and a line as a continuum can always be divided in half, and then you take that half and you can divide that in half, and then you take that half, you can divide that in half, instead of the unity of arithmetic, not as the whole of all things or anything like that. The unit of arithmetic as not being divisible, because that is a self-evident truth. And because the rest of arithmetic would fall apart from there. And because then the thing wouldn't be one, but would be two parts. What I mean to say in this is that people consider Plato as a name associated with certain views. That he thought there was a world of ideas, that he thought that justice was such and such, that he thought that self-control was self-knowledge, that he thought that these kinds of things. The importance of Plato is his employment of argumentation as a skill, as a technique, and not with a list of things that can be carried off as a sort of, and can be carved onto bronze tablets as a sort of list of commandments. That the actual process of argumentation is what is important about Plato's dialogues and his achievement. Not that he came to such and such a conclusion, even though that might be important. That he developed and collected into a sort of living skill, argumentation, which he was able to employ and apply towards a variety of fields, which had before that been sort of tied in with the field. Not able to bridge into ethics and politics and metaphysics. And that philosophers who disagree with him about some conclusion think, oh no, there aren't ideas, even if that might be essential to his process. Or think, oh no, justice is not everyone doing his own work. No, justice isn't everyone doing his own work. Or temperance in the state is not the agreement of the ruled to be ruled by the rulers and the rulers to rule them, or something like that. They disagree with something like that, that at face value may or may not be agreeable. And then to their own harm, they never become acquainted with the styles of argument, the processes of proving and disproving something which he perfected. While many conclusions have a sense of wonder because they are not obvious at first sight, because they are not things that, but they result from things that are self-evident, and they contain nothing which is not evident before. That is why they have a sense of wonder about the conclusions that are affirmed, such as those of the statesman. About, I can't remember exactly, about the comparison of the statesman or the legislator with the physician, that he might have to operate against the will of the patient if the patient is unwilling to be healed or is unwilling to submit to treatment. Those kinds of things, although at first glance would be unagreeable, result from premises which are rather obvious and hardly disagreeable, if not self-evident. And that has something to do with why he said, and why Aristotle also said that wonder is the beginning of philosophy, or wonder is the parent of philosophy, or something along those lines. Because some of his conclusions are confounded in wonder because they wouldn't accord with conventional opinion, or they wouldn't even be obviously agreeable without the premises, which would be. And the disproofs likewise could be confounded with confusion, or not confusion, confounded with wonder, because they're disproofs of positions that are either conventionally accepted or would be generally agreeable. And yet they result in absurdities, or result in contradictions, or result in something that is much less agreeable even than what is denied that seemed agreeable. So my point is that the importance of Plato is his discovery of dialectic, of his completion of that, as sort of being able to wield logic with grace and agility and with skill as a techne, not as something that merely calculates conclusions that then are just sort of carried off into a list of a worldview, but that the actual process is what the philosopher takes pleasure in. That the philosopher actually loves argumentation and the forms of arguments, and dialectic as something separable from the different fields that arguments can be applied to. And that perfection of dialectic, a dialectic is first, the love of wisdom is first the love of argument, not of mere contention, but of proofs and disproofs, of demonstrations and refutations, of demonstrations, of analysis, of demonstrations of premises to conclusions, of analysis of conclusions and other propositions into premises that are inherent in them and that are principles of further conclusions, and axioms, basically isolating axioms from an agreed upon proposition that are inherent in that, and of definition and the method of division. The method of division, again, as following through divisions of species, of a genus, different classes in order to define the thing. As with humans, we start with animals. This is just an example. When people make fun of Plato for talking about this, this is used as an example so that we understand the process. That we start with animal as a genus, and we divide that into four-legged and two-legged, and we follow the two-legged class in our course after what is a human. And we take the two-legged class and we divide that into winged and unwinged. And we choose the unwinged class. And somewhere along there, there's horned and unhorned, and hooved and unhooved. Things like that, which are an example of the process. Those are meant to acquaint us with the process, not of saying, oh, man is a two-legged biped without feathers. No, that's not something to be used as part of his worldview, as like that's his opinion about man. No, that's an illustration of the mode of reaching a definition that's supposed to be employed on other things like the statesman and sophist, which it was. So I equate philosophy with dialectic. And I consider anybody that strays from dialectic, from the processes of demonstration and refutation, fail insofar as they stray from syllogistic reasoning, from philosophy. That when someone can produce a convincing argument, some of which I agree with, if there's a modern philosopher that produces a convincing argument about something that has some elements of proof, some elements of demonstration, but is not premise, conclusion, does not take that form, or does not even lead to that form, as Plato's are often interwoven with other statements, sometimes regarding the setting and characters and all kinds of other things. But there are obvious premise, conclusion. That is insofar as they stray from that, like many modern philosophers are able to produce a convincing argument that sort of is like somebody's natural skill in being persuasive or in argument even. They have a natural instinct of argument, or they have some, but not a refined technique. Even if I agree with them about an argument about something or other, they don't show that they restrict themselves to these clean forms of argument that are not quite abstract in the sense of an algebraic equation of computer code that can be calculated without even reference to the terms that are to be input. But maintain a sort of form. First of all, that each proposition is affirmed separately or isn't combined into just a run-on argument that is overall more persuasive than not persuasive. And that definitely doesn't intend to be obscure, like some German philosophers intend to be obscure and introduce new terms, which is always a problem in philosophy, and use the mystique of nuanced terms and terms like consciousness, like when Hegel, who I have some affinity for, uses terms like consciousness and self-consciousness, and that is meant to be obscure and misuse a sort of mystique of elevated wisdom that is like they don't give an account, basically, where philosophy should be reducing things to elements, sort of like blocks. They should be so simple, it's like playing with blocks, where the first ones are self-evident and aren't using terms that haven't been agreed upon about the meaning of which, and that don't use terms that are just have a mystique of not being interpretable without a sort of whatever that would be to understand what Hegel or Heidegger, both of which I like, what they what their terms that are meant to mystify in a negative sense, in the sense of not being clear and not being able to give an account. All these are misuses of philosophy, where they wield arguments that run on with complicated terminology that never is given just definition, that doesn't require a definition of another term, and the definition isn't a genus in a species. For example, if you asked Hegel what he means by self-consciousness or by conscious as conscious, something like one of those terms, or Heidegger, what he means by Dasein, he wouldn't give you a genus and a species. He would give you a sentence or a paragraph of a ton of other mystified terms that can hardly be interpreted in order to produce an air of almost uncomprehensibility, where a term is supposed to be defined. If you look at Plato's Laws, there's a good passage of this, that a term is supposed to be defined with a genus and a species, that a triangle is a three-sided rectilinear figure. You take the genus of rectilinear figure, which is common to others besides triangles, and you cut that into some of those. One species have three sides, or a three-sided plane figure. There's plane figures or rectilinear figures is the genus. If you want to know what a triangle is, you start with a genus, a three-sided rectilinear figures. Then you give the species of what kind of that, which are obviously three-sided. Three-sided kind of rectilinear figures is what a triangle is. And the four-sided kind of rectilinear figures are what a quadrangle is. And that what a square is would be the kind of quadrilateral figures that have equal sides. There's always a genus and a species with a clear and distinct definition, which all this stuff, without those, you can't have any of the syllogistic reasoning. That's why they stray from syllogistic reasoning. That's why they aren't even within scope. Again, a quadrilateral figure would be defined as the genus of a plane figure, a planar figure, or a rectilinear figure, and the species of four-sided would be a quadrilateral figure. Then you take squares, and those would be quadrilateral figures, which are composed of what was already stated, split into the species that have equal size. So you're always cutting a genus into a species and cutting that species into subspecies in order to produce a definition that has a genus and a kind of that genus. Just as humans are defined, loosely speaking, as two-legged animals, two-legged being the species and animal being the genus, not some paragraph of anything else. And that's why geometry is important, because geometry gives us something like that that's actually clear and comprehensible and intricate and extremely intricate, where proofs in Euclid run on for beyond just premise, conclusion. Then you have that as a premise plus another premise or multiplied, but never plus. Addition doesn't really count. Arithmetic doesn't use addition because the parts of a number aren't, parts of 4 aren't 3 and 1, because that's not a product of 3 and 1. 3 and 1 are a product of 3, if anything is. You don't use addition in arithmetic. The product is not a product of addition. The parts that are thought of to be as addition are not the parts, the essential parts of the number. The number is only produced by multiplication. So 3 and 2 would be the parts of 6, not 5. And 5 would not have parts, or that would not be divisible. Wouldn't even be divisible into 5 and 1. Unless 1 is considered as just the binding factor, the form of the units as material or something. That's why all of this is run much astray. Does it say that the parts of 10 are not 9 and 1? Because 9 and 1, if anything, produce 9. And the parts of 10 are not 8 and 2, because 8 and 2 are the parts of 16. And if you read even early modern English, that's how they spoke about numbers. Although they used addition as a calculative device for practical purposes. Even when they would speak, even in early modern English. I wish I could remember the terms they use. They would say the second part of 10 is 5, and the fifth part of 10 is 2. The fifth part of 10 is 2, because if you take 10 and you divide that into fifths, each of those fifths are 2s. And the second part of 10 is 5, because if you take 10 and you divide that into two halves, the halves are composed of 5. I don't know why that is very important to me, that we think of numbers as not products of addition and subtraction, because they're parts, strictly speaking, which they are composed of as from elements, are not the numbers that you can add up to make the number or subtract from them, but are what they are a product of, the integers or numerals that they are a product of, because 2 and 5 combine to 10 when they're actually combined into something that's different from them, a third thing that's different than both the parts. I deal with this somewhat in the Alcibiades 3. This is all meant to provide an introduction. The reason I'm explaining the importance of Plato is because I've written 3 dialogues that are sequels to Plato's dialogues. There's a sequel. I wrote a sequel to the Theaetetus and a sequel to the Euthydemus and a sequel to the Alcibiades 1 and 2. So I have the Theaetetus 2, the Euthydemus 2, and the Alcibiades 3, since there was already the first and second Alcibiades. Or the second Theaetetus, the second Euthydemus, and the third Alcibiades, because Plato calls the first Alcibiades not Alcibiades 1, just the first Alcibiades and second Alcibiades. So this is meant to be an introduction, and I meant to read the introduction that I wrote that describes most of the things I've said. And I don't know if that is worth reading now. I might have said the significant portions. I think if I read the intro, I will read that in a separate video. Essentially, my point is that Plato discovered dialectic and the sort of working through of weighing out propositions against each other, of weighing out propositions that follow from each other in terms of whether or not they're consistent or inconsistent, whether or not they're concordant or discordant. If you start with a proposition that seems agreeable and you draw conclusions from that, there might result a conclusion that is tied up with the one that seemed agreeable, that either contradicts the earlier one or that is much less agreeable in which you have to disregard the earlier one. The kind of weighing out of codependent propositions that have to be accepted together or denied together. Under the standard of their harmony or disharmony, or their concord or discord, or their contradiction or non-contradiction. Using primarily contradiction as the chief standard of argument. Realizing that if something ends in a contradiction, that has to be discarded. And that is sufficient to disprove and refute something, to draw out a contradiction. And that to affirm something the premises which follow cannot result in contradictions. And have more standards. And again, I mean to say that philosophy is inseparable from dialectic and cannot be considered as a collection of affirmed propositions or of a worldview and not a way of life. This is to say that philosophy is not a way of life, that everybody might have a worldview. Everybody has a way of life. That does not amount to philosophy. Somebody doesn't just have a philosophy. And their philosophy is not a way of life. Philosophy is the process of dialectic, of argumentation, of proofs and disproofs, of demonstrations and refutations. And that Plato exemplifies skill. And that's in that art or that technique, whatever that means. And that if you consider the collection of agreed, if you consider the collection of someone's opinions, or even of what they know to be true, even what they've demonstrated as conclusions, as just a collected worldview, as a web of mutually supportive positions or propositions, apart from the weighing out of those, then I don't think that would be philosophy. But philosophy, if considered as a love of wisdom, would be a love of argumentation, of weighing out and working out those proofs and disproofs, demonstrations and refutation. And that often the conclusion cannot just be, you cannot just run away with a conclusion and take that and throw that on a bronze tablet and throw that in the form. Because the actual process is what is important and what is part of, or what is essential to the invigorated activity of philosophy, rather than inscribing a conclusion on a bronze tablet, putting that in the form, and thinking of that as being exchangeable, or that can be just handed to somebody and then they have that opinion, even if that is the right opinion. They don't have the account, and the account is within the argument for that.